Mary, the mother of Jesus. We're in this series where we're looking at her journey and her story, and we've got an interesting passage to talk about today in Mark chapter 3. So if you have a Bible, grab your Bible, open up to Mark chapter 3. This series is leading us into the Good Friday season, into resurrection season as well, and I hope that you are ready for Good Friday and Easter Sunday. I am. It's something our team is really excited about. We're excited about the experience that we're putting together where we can just encounter Jesus in that moment, encounter him at the cross on Good Friday with a more laid-back contemplative service, and then we're full bore Saturday and Sunday. I can't wait to share that hope with you, but more than just sharing it with you, I know most of you in this room have the hope of Jesus, but there's a lot of people in this world, in our city, who need the hope of Jesus. So here's my prayer. My prayer is that you don't come alone, that you invite somebody, a neighbor, a coworker, to experience and hear the resurrection of Jesus, but also to experience the love of the family of God on Saturday and Sunday. Like our host at the beginning of the service said, we have 2 Saturday services and 2 Sunday services on Easter weekend. I'd love for a lot of you to come to Saturday. Not all of you. Like I don't want to create the space issue on Sunday or move that space issue to Saturday, but if you can make the switch to Saturday service, just to open up some more space, that'd be beneficial. My hope is on Sunday that our guests can find Jesus, but before they find Jesus, they're going to have to find a parking spot, and they're going to have to find a seat, and things are starting to fill up as is. Easter Sunday is going to be a big one, so if you're like, man, it's no big deal for me to move to Saturday, worship Jesus, celebrate the Resurrection Sunday on Jesus in the Tomb Saturday. If that's you, come join us on Saturday. It's going to be the exact same service, kids ministry program. Full programming is going to be available on Saturday. I hope that you'll consider that. But before we get to the cross, before we get to the resurrection, there's a story in Mary's journey that we need to talk about, because it's one of those stories that I don't think we hear a lot about, and we don't think a lot about when we think about Mary, the mother of Jesus. Because there's this moment in Mark chapter 3 where she seems to experience a little bit of an embarrassment. And if you are a parent, you know what it's like to experience embarrassment. If you are a teenager, you know what it's like to experience embarrassment from your parents. Yeah? All right, how about this? Anybody remember the teen years when your mom and dad would embarrass you? Like they would take you out in public and do things to embarrass you. Like that parents are just so embarrassing. It's so hard to be around, where they try to do like the floss or the gritty in front of all of your friends. And it's just embarrassing. Parents are embarrassing. But here's the truth. Yeah. Some of your parents are still embarrassing you. I love that. But you know why we embarrass you, teenagers? You know why we're okay with embarrassing you in front of your friends? Because when you were in kindergarten, you embarrassed us in front of all of our friends. And so this is just payback to you. Like, how many of you remember your little kindergartner and they would like wet on you while you were out and about, and people thought you peed your pants when it was really just your kid that peed your pants? Or how many of you remember like the kindergarten, remember Mother's Day and Father's Day? Teachers think it's a great idea to give you your kid this little form about, list all the things about your mom. What does your mom love? What does your mom do? How much does your mom weigh? And what does your dad love on Father's Day? And they give those to the kids, and then the kids write these embarrassing things that you feel like you have to go back to the teacher and explain. For example, I saw this one online that a kindergartner wrote. My mom likes drinking wine on Mother's Day. What does your mom love? My mom's an alcoholic. And like these things embarrass us. I remember my son bringing one home from school, and it was a Father's Day one. Like, what does your father love to do most? And he wrote on there, Call of Duty Warzone on PlayStation 4. And I'm like, Ben, your teachers know I'm a pastor. You had to choose that I play shooting games. You couldn't put like, my dad loves to pray the most. That's what he loves doing. He reads the Bible all the time, or he loves playing. Like, our kids say these things that just embarrass us in front of other people. And I know if you're a parent, you've probably been embarrassed by your child in some ways. And I got to tell you, I don't think Mary was exempt from that either. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought or asked yourself the question, did Jesus ever do something growing up that embarrassed his mom? We're going to look at a story today where Jesus, who's no longer a kid, now he's a grown man, appears to be doing some things that might be making his mom feel uneasy and even slightly embarrassed by his actions. In Mark chapter 3, we get the story, but let me explain to you Mark chapter 1 and 2 first, because it sets up why she's embarrassed in chapter 3. In Mark chapters 1 and 2, we get this picture of Jesus who he's full-blown ministry mode now. Last week we talked about Jesus just stepping into his ministry. He recruited a few disciples, and then he did his first miracle, and then from that moment on, his ministry starts to go. He doesn't just do one miracle. He continues to do miracles. He continues to recruit more disciples, and he continues to do this ministry and this teaching ministry that he has all throughout northern Israel. And as Mary's watching him do this ministry, the way that he's doing the ministry doesn't line up with what she thought the Messiah would do for his ministry. In Mary's mind, she thought, okay, the Messiah, he's come. It's my son Jesus. He's going to free us from Rome. He's going to offend the kings and the Caesars and the Roman people, and he's going to raise up the Jewish people. He's going to give us honor. He's going to give us our honor. He's going to place us in a position where we have authority and power over all the other nations. And then she looks at what her son is doing. And it appears that he's not offending Rome. It appears that he's offending the Jewish leaders. She didn't expect that from her son. She didn't expect that from the Messiah. In Mark chapter 1 and 2, we see some stories where, yes, Jesus is recruiting some disciples, but one of the disciples we see is he recruited Levi, the tax collector, to be one of his followers. This guy is taking money from us and giving it to Rome. Why would he recruit that guy to be one of his followers? In Mark chapter 1 and 2, we see a story of Jesus performing a miracle on the Sabbath. He's doing work on the Sabbath, and good Jewish boys don't do work on the Sabbath, specifically rabbis. Jesus, who was a rabbi, surely the Messiah wouldn't do work on the Sabbath. Not only that, but he healed another guy, and instead of just healing him, he also told him that his sins were forgiven. Who does he think he is to forgive sins? The Messiah, he can heal, he can bring honor to the nation, but to claim not just to be the Son of God, but to claim to be God and to forgive people of their sins, there's got to be a part of Mary who's looking at this thinking, Jesus, you're offending the wrong people. Jesus, you might be off mission for what God has called you to do as the Messiah. And not only that, but he's doing these things, and he's attracting this large group of people. This crowd is following him, and Mary knows that in Israel, you're not supposed to attract large crowds because that will actually turn Rome on you. And not only is he attracting large crowds, but it's not the kind of people that he should be attracting. These are the sinners. These are the prostitutes. These are the poor, the homeless, the hungry, and yes, raise up the humble, but not the sinners. Don't attract the sinners to you. And so Mary, she's seeing this unfold in Mark chapter 1 and 2. And then we get to Mark chapter 3, and it appears that she's had enough. It goes on to say this, starting with verse 20. It says, then Jesus went home, and the home it's referring to here is to Peter's home in Capernaum. Then Jesus went home, and the crowd gathered again. This crowd of sinners, they gather again, so many of them, that Jesus and his disciples, that they could not even eat. And when his family heard about it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he is out of his mind. Now, who's saying this? It's the family. Jesus' family. Jesus had a family, Mary obviously, but Jesus also had some half-brothers and sisters as well. And so they see Jesus at work, and they're looking at him like, Jesus, you're off mission. And it says that they actually went out to seize him. And this word seize is more than just them going out to say, Jesus, come home, you're embarrassing us. The word seize is they went out to grab a hold of him, to potentially even to bind him and drag him home if they had to. And the reason they felt like they had to is because he is out of his mind. What is he doing? Working on the Sabbath, forgiving sins, telling people that fasting isn't necessary for his disciples when it is important for religious leaders. He's offending not Rome, he's offending us. He's offending our traditions. He's offending our religious leaders, the leaders that Mary looked up to, the leaders that taught Mary the scriptures and Mary the faith. Jesus, he's out of his mind. It goes on to talk about some of those religious leaders. It says the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he's possessed by Beelzebul, which is another name for the devil. He's possessed by the devil, and by the prince of demons, he casts out demons. You see that Jesus is beginning to get this reputation, not from Rome, he's beginning to get a reputation from the religious community. Mary's worried about that. Mary's worried about that reputation. But Jesus is a big boy. He can handle it himself. And so he calls these scribes and these religious leaders to him, and he begins to teach them. And he says this in verse 23. It says, he called them to him, and he said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? You think I'm full of Satan. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Now, it's interesting that Jesus uses the word binds the strong man here because that's exactly what the family of Jesus was intending to do to him, to go and bind him and drag him away. But Jesus says, you can't just enter his house and bind him. He's a strong man. But he says, but if you do end up doing it, that's when you can plunder his house. But truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they were saying he has an unclean spirit. The reason Jesus was saying these words was because the scribes and the religious leaders were looking at him saying, you're not the Messiah. You're full of Satan. His reputation was at risk. And Mary, she hears this. She hears the rumors in Nazareth going around what people are saying. And she's worried about how Jesus is being received by the religious leaders. She's worried about how Jesus and his role is being perceived by the community. But the reality again is, and what we learn here is that Jesus can fend for himself. Jesus is a strong man. I think one of the things that we can learn right off the bat in this first half of this story is this idea that Jesus isn't as worried about his reputation as you are. Okay, church, hear me say this again. Jesus isn't as worried about his reputation as you are. Jesus is not worried that he's saying some things that people are taking the wrong way. Jesus is not worried that he's teaching some things and doing some things and inviting some people that are offending the rest of the world. Jesus isn't as concerned with his reputation as you are. I think some of us are really concerned about the reputation of Jesus in our world. Are we not, church? Like, how many of you, or maybe how many times have you heard the words of Jesus or read something in the Bible and thought, oh, I need to reword that. Jesus, you can't say that today. You can't say that in our culture. You can't say that in our country. How many times have you felt like you've had to apologize for Jesus' teaching? I think that's a popular thing to do right now in the church world. And the reason we do that is because we think we're helping Jesus, but really what we're concerned about is not how people will view Jesus, we're concerned with how people will view us. Here's what we think. Like Jesus says something that's hard for the world to hear, the world gets offended at it, and we're like, man, sorry, he didn't mean it that way. Like, let me tell you, like, he's really a good guy. Here's what he really means. And what we end up doing is we try to heal our relationship with the world by distancing ourselves from the person of Jesus. And so when you apologize for Jesus, you're not drawing anybody closer to Jesus. You're distancing yourself farther from Jesus. And that's what Mary's experiencing in this moment. She feels like, man, I've got to apologize for my son. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of the Most High, but I think he's just off mission, and I need to go rest. I need to go grab him, and I'll bring him home. We'll have the conversation. I'll remind him what the angels said and what the shepherds and Matt, like, we'll fix this situation. But Jesus can take care of himself. The story goes on, and now we get to see the picture. The family has finally arrived at this house in Capernaum, and in verse 31 it says this: his mothers and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside. They're looking for you. They're seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking around at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and here are my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. And then you know what Jesus does? He continues teaching the disciples who are sitting in the house. He continues doing his ministry. He continues healing and preaching and bringing good news to the poor. And he leaves his family outside. Now, catch the impact of that. He left his mother standing outside. She traveled. It was a few days' journey to get there, to bring him home. She asks him a question. He does not respond to her. He responds to the people in the house and says, you are my family. Let's keep going on with this. Let's keep having this talk. Let's keep doing this ministry. And Mary is left outside. Unfortunately, Mary's story here doesn't really resolve as nicely as the previous ones do. In fact, the reality is we don't actually hear anything else about Mary for the rest of Jesus' ministry. You don't hear her name pop up one more time for the rest of Jesus' ministry. In fact, the next time she's mentioned is not until Jesus is on the cross. It's not until the crucifixion scene. That's when she comes back into the story. Now, there's a part of us, there's a part of me that hopes the best for Mary's story. There's a part of me that says, well, maybe like she kind of got it, and then she kind of fixed her own attitude and like was still like, okay, I get it, Jesus, I'm on board. Whatever you say, that's what I'm going to listen to. Whatever you do, I'll do. And part of us wants to believe that, but we really don't see that in Scripture at all. We don't see her rejoining the group of people. We don't see her traveling around with the disciples. We don't see her interjecting about the importance of her son. Maybe that happened. But what we know of Jesus' brothers, James specifically, he didn't become a believer until after Jesus rose from the dead. That's when his faith really began. And part of me wonders is, did Mary just struggle for the rest of Jesus' ministry of, who is he? Why is he acting this way? I wonder if she struggled from then on out. What it appears from Scripture is that Jesus' biological family, Mary and his siblings, they distanced themselves from Jesus. Not that they gave up on Jesus, but there was definitely some distance there from Jesus and his ministry as it unfolded in the chapters remaining in the gospel. Now, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about how Mary came back to Jesus at the foot of the cross, so you're going to have to come Friday to hear the rest of that story. But here in the ministry, Mary's left outside. And I think there's some things that we can learn from this interaction that she has with Jesus and that Jesus has with his disciples. And there's three things that I want to point out real fast. The first one is this: faith is thicker than blood. This is what Jesus teaches his disciples in that moment, in that house, that faith is thicker than blood. In fact, Jesus says this time and time again throughout his ministry as he's bringing his disciples in. He's telling his disciples, if you follow me, it might cause division in your family. Are you ready to have division in your family? How many of you have experienced that? That your belief in Jesus Christ has caused division in some of your families. People don't understand why you prioritize him, why you read the scriptures, why you believe the things they do, and there's some division in your family. Guess what? Jesus experienced that as well. He knows exactly what you're going through. And what Jesus says is, even when blood divides, even when genetics are split, faith is still family. He looks at the people around him and saying, you're my brother, you're my sister, you're my mother. We are a family because faith is thicker than family. Which leads us to this next point, and it's a point that Mary had to learn. It was this, that proximity to Jesus is no substitute for following Jesus. Let me say that again. This is important for us to grab a hold of, because some of us, we act the opposite. We believe that proximity means that we're near Jesus, but proximity is no replacement for following Jesus. Like, of all the people that ever walked the earth, Mary is the one who is closest to Jesus, right? I think we can agree on that. It does not get any closer than carrying somebody inside of you. All right? Mary was as close to Jesus as it come. She carried him inside of her. Jesus fed at her breast. Jesus had his diapers changed by her. Mary bathed Jesus. She lived with Jesus in the house together day in and day out. It does not get any closer to Jesus than Mary. But proximity, and Mary had proximity. Proximity is no substitute for following Jesus. In fact, what we read in this story is that your posture reveals more about your faith in Jesus than your proximity does. Your posture reveals more than your proximity. I mean, look at the posture in this story. When we read this story, there's two groups of people. Did you notice that? There's a group of people inside the house, and there's a group of people outside the house. The people inside the house were sitting at the feet of Jesus. The people outside of the house were standing, calling him out. The people inside were sitting down in this position of submission, in this position of looking to him, in this position of learning from him so that they can act accordingly. And then there's this other position outside the house. And it was the family who was standing outside, the people who were supposed to be closest to him, the people who had the closest proximity to him. Their posture showed, hey, you're in our family, we're not in yours. And I think one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is this question. Do we obey Jesus, or are we just near Jesus? Do you obey Jesus, or are you just near Jesus? Because what Jesus said is, whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. If faith is thicker than blood, obedience is thicker than blood for Jesus as well. And he says, it's whoever obeys me, whoever does my will, whoever does the will of my Father, that is my family. And so, church, we have to ask ourselves the question, is sitting in church good enough for Jesus? Is being close to Jesus, in close proximity to him, is that good enough for him? Or maybe he's calling us to do more. Maybe he's calling us to obey him. Because a lot of us know him. A lot of us know his words. A lot of us know his stories. A lot of us go to church. But how many of us are actually following him? Here's what Mary learned about following that I think we can learn as well, this third point. That faith transfers through following, not through family. Faith transfers through following and not just family. And can I tell you, this is one of these points that is meaningful for me. And maybe it's meaningful for some of you as well. Because I've got a family. I've got children. I've got 2 daughters and a son. And one of my prayers is that they follow Jesus. And I'm guessing many of you who have children, you're in the same situation. Your prayer is that your sons, your daughters will follow Jesus. You love Jesus with your whole heart. You've given so much and sacrificed so much to be in his family. And you want them to love Jesus as well. Whenever I accepted the call as a high schooler to go into the ministry and to devote my life to the gospel message, I knew that someday I wanted to have kids, and that kind of scared me because I'm like, God, I want my kids not to ride my coattails into the kingdom of God. I want my kids to own their faith on their own. Because here's what I recognize. It's really easy for a pastor's kid to assume that they are in the family of Jesus because they're in the family of a pastor. It's really easy for a pastor kid to say, look at my mom's faith, look at my dad's faith. Surely that just automatically comes to me. Surely I inherit that faith in some capacity. And the reality is you don't inherit faith. Saving faith is claimed, not inherited. And for some of us, we look at our kids and we want to force them into the faith, but the reality is they have to choose it on their own. We can lead them to Jesus, but they have to make the decision to grab his hand and follow him. Because faith comes through following, not through family. Some of you, though, you're on the opposite side and you're like, well, Jesus, I'm in, right? Like, look at my grandma. She's pretty legit with her faith. Look at my mom and my dad. They love you. Surely I'm in as well. I don't think Jesus is going to be at some gate in heaven when we get there asking us why he should let us in. But some people have that metaphor of like, why should I let you in? I believe that some people will truly give this answer. Well, you know my mom, don't you? She's in there somewhere. I just thought I would just kind of jump in with her. Like, what about my dad? You're like, Jesus, you know my dad. You guys were close. I thought I would just kind of jump in on that as well. But the reality is you don't get into heaven. You don't come into salvation because you know somebody in your family. Salvation and faith comes through you joining Jesus' family. An important question to ask is this question: is Jesus in my family or am I in his? Because there's a huge difference. Is Jesus in my family? Is Jesus' name talked about in my house? Or have I joined Jesus' family? Some of us are banking on the fact that Jesus is in my family, so I must be in, right? Some of you, I know, think like, oh, I was raised in a Christian family. We were raised praying at the dinner table. My question is not were you raised in a Christian family. My question is, do you follow Jesus? Some of you think, well, his words, they're plastered on our kitchen walls. We bought things from the Christian bookstore and hung them up in our house. But is Jesus' word plastered and hung in your heart? Some of you are like, well, of course I'm a Christian. When I was a baby, I was dedicated to Jesus. I was sprinkled as a child. My family did that for me. But my question is, did you choose him for yourself, or did family choose Jesus for you? Because saving faith is claimed, it's not inherited. You can have Jesus in your family and have your life never be changed. Jesus can be in your family and your life will never be changed. But when you join Jesus' family, when you sit at his feet, that's when everything changes. Mary had Jesus in her family. Jesus sat at her dinner table. But now Mary came to realize, and Jesus pointed out, Mary, you got to sit at my dinner table. When are you going to join me at my table? Because then Jesus looks around at the crowd of people who were sitting there at his feet, and he says, this is my mother, this is my brother, this is my sister. You know, this story reminds me a little bit of the story we told last week of Mary finding Jesus in the temple, and she finds boy Jesus in the temple, and he's sitting there, and the religious leaders are surrounding him, and she's worried, she's panicked because she expected Jesus to be with her, but she'd lost him, and now she'd found him, and she asks Jesus to come home, and what does Jesus do? He submits to her. He gets up, and he goes home with her. I think she probably expected the same thing to happen this time. She runs off to Capernaum, she finds Jesus, she asks Jesus to come home, and this time Jesus says, Mother, it's time for you to come home. But she stayed outside.